Hello and welcome to the Ambient Castle podcast. I'm your noble host, JustLeeBelmont, and today we're going to be talking about Overwatch. More specifically, we're going to be talking about my criticisms regarding the game. Now, as a brief sort of overview as to what Overwatch is, it's a competitive 6v6 game in which you're trying to accomplish different objectives depending on the map that you're on. The big thing that separates this game from other games within its category is that it has the idea of hero switching as its core concept. And to me, I think this core concept is inherently flawed for several reasons. But before we delve into that, I think it's important to understand the different factors as to why I believe this is a flawed concept. For one, I think it's important to consider how much individual skill matters within a team setting, and in this game, I would say that the game is incredibly team-reliant in all the worst ways. For a moment, let's consider all the factors that go into each individual character within the game. Every single character in this game has a left click, a shift ability, an E ability, and an ultimate, with some slight variance amongst the cast. Now personally, I don't think this is enough options at any given time for a single character. I understand the notion of wanting to give everyone on the team their own time to shine by having their own amount of abilities, but as a single unit within the game, I don't feel like I can contribute very much due to my lack of options. My problem with this is that you're defined by your character, not how you play your character, because of how limited their move pool is. The lack of available options and the lack of universal mechanics across the entire cast make this a very difficult solo experience, which makes it even more so reliant upon your teammates. Now, it's a team game, you might say, so in theory you should rely on them to some extent, right? The problem is, you need too much teamwork to accomplish basic tasks in this game, and that's largely due in part to each character not having enough options to adapt to the opponent's playstyle. When the best option becomes to change who you're playing rather than how you're playing, then I think that becomes a problem in terms of how the heroes are designed in this game. To this effect, I think team composition matters way too much because of this inherent problem. For instance, let's consider the typical 2-2-2 meta. We have 2 DPS, we have 2 tanks, and 2 healers. While this sounds good in theory, it doesn't necessarily work when put into practice. And when I say it doesn't work, the problem is that the community highly incentivizes you to do this, in addition to Blizzard suggesting this even on the hero select screen. So before we even get into a match, we're already being told how we're expected to play the game, rather than playing who we want to play. I personally think it's unrealistic to expect every player to be good at every single character, which really bothers me when we're considering the 2-2-2 meta. My other major gripe with this is the fact that there's not an equal amount of role representation amongst the different characters in this. We need to consider that tanks and support both have less characters within the DPS category, which shouldn't come as a surprise when you see the vast amount of players choosing DPS as their insta-lock choice. My other complaint with this is that it's also emphasizing team composition, once again, more so than playing well. And while it's all fine and dandy to assume that, yes, it's the community trying to push this, yes, Blizzard is trying to push this, the effect even extends to the gameplay as well. The game was very, very clearly designed that you were meant to have all 3 of these roles on your team at any given time. And a big amount of that has to do with healing in this game specifically, which in my opinion kind of ruins the entire experience. Why healing specifically? Well, a large part of that is due to the maps not having enough health packs on them. This is an issue because if the enemy team has a healer and you don't, you're at a severe disadvantage because of your lack of sustain. The fact that this game treats healers as a necessity rather than an option is a problem to me. Now, as an example of healers being an option rather than a necessity, let's use League of Legends as an example. Because how the game is designed with enough universal options, such as recalling, potions, and various healing items throughout the game, you don't need a healer in that game as much as you do in Overwatch. For instance, let's say that the enemy team in League of Legends has Soraka, a character primarily designed around healing. The fact that they have a healer and your team doesn't matter as much because you still have access to items that every character is able to purchase. Now, if we take that same line of thinking and apply it to Overwatch, if the enemy team has a Mercy, and you don't have a healer, you're at a massive disadvantage by comparison. And I say that because we have various things to worry about if they have a Mercy. They have constant healing, they have res, and they have an ult that makes them very difficult to shoot for about 20 to 30 seconds. The fact that the enemy team has the ability to negate one person dying on their team, in addition to sustaining the entire group, is a problem. And it wouldn't be an issue if there were more options for the characters to heal throughout the game, but the sad truth is, a bunch of the characters within Overwatch do not have self-sustain. And that's because the game is designed to have a specific role on your team at any given time in order for you to win the match reasonably. I understand the notion of wanting to make everyone feel like they can contribute something to the team, by having different roles to allow all different types of playstyles. But the issue here is that when the roles are both expected and required in order to stand a realistic chance of beating the enemy team, I find it hard to embrace the idea of accessibility when it comes at the cost of limiting player expression. That same amount of accessibility also hurts the game in the long run, because it devalues raw mechanical skill and emphasizes team composition. In my eyes, I feel like Overwatch is a casual game trying to be competitive because of this accessibility. And I think the game fails as both a casual and a competitive game in that regard. Because the skill floor is so low to perform at a decent level, it makes it that much harder to distinguish the good players from the bad. It also doesn't help that a decent amount of the characters within the game aren't required to properly aim just to function. I'm firmly in the boat that we shouldn't get rid of the fundamentals of shooters within both a casual and competitive setting, and aim shouldn't be devalued as much as it is within Overwatch. From the competitive perspective, we need only look at the meta at any given time during the Overwatch Pro League seasons. Simply looking at how homogenized the team compositions are within the Pro League setting should be a good indicator of the inequities between how much hero choices matter, as opposed to valuing individual performance. I mentioned earlier that one of my biggest frustrations with the game is lack of universal mechanics, and I personally like to view universal mechanics as a means to balance out the roster, because as it stands, I feel like the roster is extremely unbalanced. Well, more specifically, I feel like a few certain heroes are extremely unbalanced. My biggest issues are specifically Widowmaker, Hanzo, Pharah, and Tracer. When it comes to the two snipers, their inclusion always frustrated me when looking at Overwatch. The fact that we have two skill shot based heroes that can insta-kill you from across the map is incredibly frustrating. While this may come across as a hypocrisy because I've been praising the idea of raw mechanical skill as an underlying factor that should be present in shooters, I think the fact that these two characters can exclusively deal with more than half the cast from across the map is a problem. My issue is with the regards of sameness. These two characters have an advantage that nobody else in the cast does. So when played at the highest level, they have the best carry potential. And to that degree, I suppose we should reward playing well. But my issue lies in the fact that no other character's primary weapon can be as strong as that. To this degree, I'd like to use Rainbow Six Siege as my way of evening out the playing field. In that game, every single headshot is an insta-kill. This simple concept single-handedly balances out the cast so everyone is viable because of this one universal mechanic. I think that's a good way of balancing out the game. The idea of fairness is thrown into question when these two characters exclusively have this ability. The fact that only the snipers are able to contest each other from that range at any given time is an issue. In most instances, it pretty much validates a hero swap at that point once Widow or Hanzo are going crazy. At that point, your options are either one of the flankers, one of the shield tanks, or one of the dive tanks. Now, once again, my issue lies in the idea of having to switch to find the most optimal way to deal with this character. And from one perspective, it's kind of a pain to be stuck behind a shield most of the game because of one character just being able to do this from across the map. To this degree, I believe the snipers are limiting team composition, and therefore killing any flexibility your team could potentially have. I personally don't believe a hero specifically should be able to have this much influence over the game, and they only have this much influence because there's not enough systems in place to counteract it. Another hero that I have another genuine problem with is Pharah. We need to consider that her vertical mobility gives her an advantage that nobody else in the cast has. This is compounded by the fact that very few characters can deal with her if she's played properly, much less if she has a Mercy sticking with her. Let's consider her best answers for a moment, if you will. Let's start with some of the obvious examples that the community likes us to believe that are good for dealing with Pharah. We have McCree, we have Soldier, and we have Widowmaker. The first two are good at dealing with Pharah to a certain extent. Once Pharah goes beyond a specific range, these two characters become basically useless because of damage fall-off with hit-scan weapons. The same, however, cannot be said for Widow. But my problem with this is that you're relying on a high skill floor character to deal with a low skill floor character. To me, I don't find that equal whatsoever. You shouldn't need to play a harder character to deal with an easier one. Now let's assume we throw Mercy into the mix. Pharmercy is bar none the easiest duo combo to pull off in Overwatch. Mechanically, neither of these characters are very difficult to play. However, the answer to dealing with both of them in tandem requires much more effort than it is to play them. Something simple to play shouldn't require that much coordination to take down. But unfortunately, with the lack of tools available to more than half the cast to dealing with Pharah on our own, only makes things that much more difficult when you throw another hero into the mix. This also ties back into the idea of team reliance. It's unrealistic for one character to 2v1 constantly in a team setting. From an individual perspective as someone who's been the hit scan in this scenario, Far too often I've been put in the position of having to deal with both of these characters coming at me at once. I think it's unbalanced to expect one character to deal with two, much less requiring another teammate to help me out in this situation, because the numbers simply aren't high enough to deal with damage fall-off. Now, I know what you're thinking. Snipers and Pharah, they'd probably be easy to deal with if you could just ignore them, right? By hiding under cover? The problem with that is how both the maps and the objectives are designed within Overwatch. Every objective in this game has one thing in common. You need to stand on it. And that alone, in and of itself, really limits where you can hide against these characters. And that's not even considering team strategies for approaching the objective too. With free reign of being able to snipe down a hallway, or being able to rain missiles from afar, gives characters like these too much influence in a game where you're forced to stand out in the open. Let's also consider that the objectives are also located in the same spot every game, which leaves matches to become more homogenized throughout the life cycle of the game. Let's contrast that to Rainbow Six Siege once more, where the defenders have the option to choose from one of several different starting locations for the objective. Not only does this add replayability for the game, but it also allows for a lot of different options in terms of how to approach the map. And that's not even considering which operators you bring when you're attacking. Certain routes might be open for you this round, more breaching entries, more doors, or possibly a different route you wouldn't even expect. Compare that to Overwatch, where it's a static location every game, which allows only for so much variation between that. This is further compounded by the fact that there's very few options for attacking in a lot of these maps. The central choke point is a giant overarching gate. My issue with it? Unless you have some sort of vertical mobility, there are not enough options to approach this objective. This problem isn't mutually exclusive to this map either. Let's also consider Eichenwald. At some point, this map was even redesigned to try and accommodate to these complaints. The problem with that? All they added was a tiny room that has the same issue as the main choke point. If anything, I'd argue that it's even worse because it's much easier to die to spam from that doorway. The lack of entrances and routes for all the different characters show the map's inequities toward the cast. When something as simple as the map doesn't give enough options for the cast, I think we have a problem. What are our mobile characters supposed to do at this point? Simply poke at the choke? Because I seem to notice that's a common trait that happens within Overwatch. That same amount of linearity also ties into the flankers within the game. Remember earlier how I mentioned I really hated Tracer? Well, a large part of that is due to the map design as well. Because of how linear the maps are, it's very easy to take advantage of an unsuspecting flank, and therefore slowly whittle down a team before they can even get past the choke point. This is compounded by the fact that since the choke point is essentially where most of the battles take place, it's very rare to see teammates turn behind. Why? Because there's no incentive to. The big reason everyone is so adamant about poking at the choke is for one reason alone, and that's to get the one tool that you really need to win that push. In what I consider another issue with the game, the ultimates. While I do admit that I was a big fan of raising the meter to try and build the ultimates, it's the idea of the ultimates themselves that really hurt the game. To me, I like to view Overwatch as this one giant game of tug-of-war, and to me, tug-of-war should be won with strength alone. And while it may seem practical on paper to have that one steroid boost to give you that one final push that you need, I think that the ultimates were a bit too excessive. My issue with ults is that it pretty much devolves into a matter of which team can ult pool harder than the other. And the team with more ults is at a significant advantage by comparison. Unlike, let's say, a super from a fighting game, ults have way more influence on the course of a game. And the reason behind that is that they're incredibly powerful. They pretty much kill almost any hero very quickly. And most of the time, that's just one ultimate. Imagine more than that. Factor that on top of regular enemies just shooting at you, in addition to having to worry about a crazy guy with a dragon blade coming at you, and you've got a serious issue in your match. Ultimates have too much of an emphasis on timing, rather than focusing on the constant struggle that should be ideally the goal in tug-of-war. Another thing to keep in mind is the length of the matches as well. I know I keep alluding to tug-of-war, but I feel like it honestly is one of the best comparisons for this game. The big difference between the two is that Overwatch matches are significantly longer by comparison, and because there's that constant battle, you don't really feel the results of your labor until the very end of it. Consequently, you also feel the stress of not succeeding as you're constantly playing it. Not getting a payload cap or a 2 CP cap at the crucial moment can spell certain disaster for your team, especially considering that the timer is constantly ticking. And that disaster not only extends to the gameplay, but to the morale of the game as well. I think Overwatch is a very high-stress game despite its accessibility. And I think a lot of that has to be a culmination of everything we've talked about since now. I can't help but wonder if the Overwatch developers had this in mind when they also created the loot box system as a means to relieve stress. As a means of rewarding the player through each match, you also get rewarded with individual items that are contained within the loot boxes. Granted, you don't have to win the matches, of course. That said, I'm firmly against the idea of having microtransactions within a premium product. I'm not a fan of a system of have and have-nots, especially in a paid game, and it's something that's always rubbed me the wrong way since the game's inception. One of the big reasons why is because I feel like there's more effort being put into the skins rather than improving the game itself. Rarely, if ever, am I excited to see a new event in Overwatch, because the vast majority of it just includes new skins. Contrast that with one of the big updates to Team Fortress 2, the Jungle Inferno update, which not only included proper balance patches, but included 6 new maps in addition to cosmetic items. That, in my opinion, is how you do a proper update. Contrast that to Overwatch, where we've had only 7 new characters since the inception of the game. Not really a lot when you consider the 2-2-2 meta, as we mentioned earlier. And it's not just that, it's the lack of proper map fixes despite the game being out for so long. And the slow, painful trickle of new heroes just isn't helping either. I feel like the core design philosophies of Overwatch are in all the wrong places at the moment, and I really want this game to succeed. And you know what? The game has succeeded in terms of revenue. But in terms of player satisfaction, I couldn't be more frustrated with it.